Good afternoon, everyone. And if I could just have your attention, because we have a few important housekeeping announcements just to make to ensure everyone has a safe and enjoyable experience at the conference. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, so if the alarm goes off, then please evacuate the building as quickly as possible by the nearest exit or a route identified by the hotel staff and congregate in the allocated area near the car park. If you require any assistance, then please speak to a member of the SCoTENS committee, and they're seated at the front here, and they'll be happy to help. The main conference sessions take place in this room, and refreshments will be served outside in the open space where you can enjoy the views. And could I ask that you sign up in advance for any parallel sessions just to check numbers, and the locations are the Fermanagh Suites 1 and 2, and our posters are outside, so please enjoy those. And we also have presentations in the members' loft. This evening, just to summarise, you're invited to join us for the drinks reception at 6:30, just outside there, followed by the conference dinner at 7 o'clock here in the Ross Suite. And then looking ahead to Friday, the parallel sessions will begin promptly at 8:30, so just to draw your attention to that earlier start. And just before lunch, we'll be presenting the inaugural Harry McMacken Award. So it's a special moment, and we hope that you'll stay to celebrate that with us. We're using the hashtag SCoTENS2025 on socials, so please just check with the presenters before sharing in case it's part of their doctoral research. And we also have photographers for the duration of the conference, so just let them know if you don't wish to be included. So that's all our announcements at this stage, and let's move swiftly to the official welcome. So, good afternoon, guests, colleagues, friends, and doctoral students. It's lovely to see the old and new members alike present here in the room. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 SCoTENS Annual Conference held here at the stunning Lough Erne Resort, a setting that offers the perfect backdrop for reflection, dialogue and inspiration as we come together to explore this year's compelling theme, a new era for professionalism, teacher identity, authenticity and agency. This theme invites us to embark on a timely and critical journey, one that examines how the evolving landscape of education is reshaping what it means to be a professional teacher. As society, technology and policy continue to shift, we find ourselves at a crossroads where artificial intelligence, digital innovation and changing expectations are redefining curriculum delivery, assessment practices, and the very nature of teacher-student relationships. Throughout this conference, we'll explore the complex forces that influence teacher professionalism. We'll consider how policy frameworks, curriculum reforms, and societal pressures are shaping and sometimes challenging our sense of identity, authenticity, and agency as educators. Together, we will uncover both the pressures and possibilities that lie ahead and consider how these dynamics impact pedagogy, collaboration, and teacher autonomy. This is more than just a conference. It's a call to action, a space to share ideas, challenge assumptions, and reimagine the future of teaching in this new era. I encourage each of you to engage fully, speak boldly, ask hard questions, and listen deeply as we navigate this transformative moment in education. Welcome once again, and thank you for being part of this important conversation. Let's enjoy a fantastic conference together. So without further ado, we'll move on to the first keynote of the conference. So ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Viv Ellis to our conference today. Professor Ellis is a distinguished global leader in teacher education, and although he's Dean of Faculty of Education at Monash University, Australia, Professor Ellis is currently based at the University College London's Institute of Education, where he's an honorary professor with the Centre for Teachers and Teaching Research and responsible for leading several funded research initiatives. His career spans continents and institutions, marked by visionary leadership. Prior to moving to Monash, Professor Ellis was the founding co-director of the Centre for Innovation in Teacher Education and Development, a strategic partnership between King's College London and the Teachers College Columbia University in New York, and also a member of the advisory panel for teacher education for the Norwegian Agency for Quality Assurance in Higher Education. From 2002 to 2013, he worked in the Department of Educational Studies at Oxford University, where he co-convened the Centre for Social, Cultural and Activity Theory Research and was author of one of the most downloaded journal articles in Mind, Culture and Activity. During his tenure as Dean at Monash from 2020 to 2025, Professor Ellis led transformative restructuring of the faculty, fostering a culture of inclusivity and excellence. Under his leadership, Monash's Faculty of Education became the highest performing faculty in the university's 2024 Your Say Engagement Survey. Professor Ellis is a global expert in teacher education, having worked with government agencies and NGOs across the UK, Europe and Middle East, Asia and Australia. He's also a member of the Advisory Board of the Faculty of Educational Sciences at the University of Helsinki and an advisor to the Finnish Teacher Education Forum. Professor Ellis's research has been funded by many international governments, the British Academy, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Norwegian Research Council, the Higher Education Academy, to name but a few. He has served on editorial boards of leading international journals and has an extensive published background with recent books such as Teacher Education in Crisis, The State, the Market and Universities in England, which since its publication as an e-book in September 2023 has been the fastest downloaded open access academic publication ever for Bloomsbury Academic. Similarly, his book, The New Political Economy of Teacher Education, The Enterprise Narrative and Shadow State, has been described as a significant contribution that should be read by everyone who is deeply concerned about the present and future of teacher education. It's been nominated for the 2024 Critics' Choice Award for the American Educational Studies Association. Professor Ellis, we are honoured and delighted to have you with us today to share your expertise, insights and knowledge. We look forward to be challenged to think deeply about our role in initial teacher education and to consider what the future holds as we move forward in this rapidly changing educational landscape. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Many thanks, Pamela. It's always strange listening to people talk about you like that. So I want to thank you, and I want to begin by just reflecting on something that Pamela alluded to, which is I've just returned from 5 years in Australia. And when you work in Australia, you quickly find out that for formal meetings, especially meetings like this, conferences, there's a tradition which has emerged over the last 20 years of doing something called acknowledging country. If you're a non-Indigenous person, you talk about the gratitude and the respect you pay to the owners of the lands that you're on. And if you're lucky enough to have an Indigenous leader, an elder present, they do a welcome to country. And they then invite you to share the land that they're on. So it's very difficult. I've done 2 talks since I've been back, and it's very difficult not to start with an acknowledgement of country. But when you see this beautiful countryside around us, I should click, shouldn't I? That connection to land, which Indigenous Australians feel, because it also signifies their sense of connection to culture and history and language and identity. You cannot fail to feel connection. And from an outsider, and I come to you as an outsider, I feel kind of profound sense of respect for such a beautiful context for a meeting such as this. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting me to share in your conference. Just before we began, Pamela mentioned something which came as a little bit of a shock, which is, as some of you might know, I was an external examiner at Queen's for 4 years. I was also an external examiner at St Angela's ATU, as it now is, for 4 years. And Pamela told me that some of the people I work with closely at Queen's have passed. So I'd like to thank Queen's, those colleagues, and also the ATU Sligo colleagues who are thankfully still here with us, for everything I've learned from them over 8 years at different points in my career. So, having expressed that kind of thanks for your welcome and gratitude, I'm going to give you a sense of where we're going today. So this is my kind of outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about returning to this conference after 8 years. 2017 I was here, and I'm going to give you a particular thank you, to give SCoTENS a particular thank you. I'm going to talk about keywords and why I think the concept is useful, particularly in our field. And there may be a bit of opportunity for audience participation there, but I don't know how warmed up you are. So if you don't participate, that's fine. I'm going to talk a bit about the professionalizing project, because I think the words you've chosen in your title for this conference are keywords in teacher education and are part of a professionalizing project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about reframing them using the concept of professional creativity, which I've worked with on and off now for 10 years or so. Then I'll come on to talking about what I think is a kind of core responsibility of teacher education and teacher educators, which is helping to re-energize professional creativity, this concept. And I'm going to talk about some recent research that I've done with a guy called Ian Cushing from Manchester Metropolitan University, around teacher educators in England, which is a very particular case. And my perspective and my focus in the talk will be on teacher education and teacher educators. And obviously that has a link, very interesting, complex set of links to teachers and teaching. Many of us were teachers before we were teacher educators. I was an English teacher, but my focus and the perspective will be very much on teacher education and from the university or higher education perspective. I'm going to try and leave time for discussions, because I think there's been a change to the program. So maybe there'll be time for, there certainly will be, because I'm not going to go on for that long, time for questions and discussion. And I'm going to end with an invitation to you. So something that you might like to do individually or in groups. So this was the conference that I attended in Dundalk in 2017. And it was fascinating. I was in the position of being the closing keynote. So I talked to Tom Walsh earlier about he's in that position today, and it's an interesting one. You watch the whole conference run by, and if you're anything like me, Tom, you'd be wondering whether your PowerPoints are in the right order and so on and so forth. So it's a privilege to be in the first keynote position this time. And it's really interesting to be here after 7 years to see the extent to which the activity and the energy of SCoTENS has grown. And what is really interesting to see is how effective and active it has become as an organization across the border. And I think probably the most active and the most engaged cross-border organization, which is really interesting and quite the achievement, I think. The other thing that I think makes SCoTENS really interesting and unusual is the perspective from a variety of sectors. So I remember the representation of teacher unions. I remember the contribution of curriculum authorities, of teacher registration bodies, and so on. I think that's really important. And it's not universal around the world for these kinds of groups, these stakeholders, to be part of organizations like this. It is in Norway. Pamela mentioned, I've worked there too. They even have a union for student teachers, a student teacher union as well as a teacher union. And they're always part of debates and conferences like this. So it's great to be here and honored to come back for a second time in the first keynote position. And I think you can see it there. That was the title of my last keynote. And what that title included, what was included in that title was this concept of key words. And it was the first time when I gave that talk, which is around innovation, evidence, and reform, that I'd used this idea of keywords, which I'll come on to in a moment, from Raymond Williams, who is a cultural theorist, in the context of teacher education. And that led to a lot of discussions after 2017 with colleagues at King's and international colleagues, publications on the idea and why it was interesting and useful to focus on keywords, and then finally this. So it's now a book series. So the Keywords in Teacher Education book series emerged from something that SCoTENS stimulated in 2017. And it is very much grown out of that idea of words that have multiple meanings that change and develop over time. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, this series has now got an editorial board. It includes people from the United States, Ken Zeichner, Maureen Robinson from South Africa, Chi-Ming Mao from China, and Joe Lampert, my Monash colleague. And it's proved to be really successful to the extent that Bloomsbury want more, which I'm going to come back to in the end. You can see some of the titles that have already been published. These are big words, full of meaning, subject to multiple interpretations, subject to debate and contestation. The next title to come out is Practice, which I think in our field is it means so many different things to people who are coming from different places. And that's by Kathy Schultz from the University of Colorado. That follows that is Evidence. That's coming out later next year. Innovation. So this is a series that's growing and is successful. So at this point, I want to say thank you, SCoTENS, because that invitation to talk to this conference in 2017 grew into something. It's one of those rare occasions where an idea really came to life. So thank you very much. Now, I've taken from your conference description and title 3 key words. You'll notice that I've missed the word authentic. I've taken authenticity out. And there are 2 reasons for that, really. The first is I'm not sure, as I understand it, that authenticity is a key word in teacher education. It maybe signals some questions around things like artificial intelligence and so on that are interesting questions and problematics for us to discuss. But the second thing that I would say is, in the talk, I am going to make a reference to generative AI, which I hope is pertinent and maybe gives a different perspective on its use in research. So to come back to keywords, the concept comes from Raymond Williams, Welsh cultural theorist, published this book in first edition in 1976. It's not a dictionary, it's a series of short essays. None of these words, profession, identity, agency, are in the first edition or the second edition. Other people have updated them since and have included these words. But what is a keyword? It's a high-frequency word that we use in a field all the time. So experience is a good one in teacher education, and what that means. Does that mean a school placement? So it's we mean different things by it. And he gave a good sort of description of how we know something is a keyword. It's when we're in conversation with somebody and we use the same word, and then as the conversation ensues, we realize we mean entirely different things. And there's an extent to which it allowed us to converse, but then we start realizing we have quite divergent views. And the words themselves, and sometimes they're phrases, so I think, social justice is a key word, even though it's 2, means many different things. There are many complex and interesting dynamics underneath these key words, and they've changed and evolved over time, and very often we don't notice. And our conversations assume that the meanings are continuous. So Williams said the problematics of the keyword's meaning is inextricably bound up with the problem it was being used to discuss. And in philosophy, there's a similar, but not exactly the same concept, called essentially contested concepts. A concept that, you put it out there and it is immediately subject to interrogation. So I've selected from your title clearly, because you're interested in a moment, this is a moment, it's a new era. So in your new era, in your moment, there seem to be three really important keywords, and the first of those is profession. So, time for a bit of audience participation. What do we think we mean by profession then? And if the 100 of you that are feeling you're not going to respond with one voice, maybe I could ask the SCoTENS committee. Because you wrote it. What do we think? Profession.
Setting standards.
Setting standards, absolutely. So a lot of the work, for example, that we associate with teacher education grew out of a professional standards movement. So the work of someone like Lee Shulman, for example, National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. What else? Shared practice, yeah. So a sense of a collective, to some extent, common knowledge, a common sense of practice or practices, yeah. I
was thinking of kind of
a guild, yeah. So there's a German word called Gemeinschaft, which signals that kind of guild. It's a group of people who essentially share a set of skills and a kind of a local culture, a community. Yeah. Yes?
It makes me think of like commitment and passion, rather than just the word job.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point to make, because it's one that is really not there a lot in the research literature on professions, professionalism and teaching, but it is there in research on professionalism in relation to science. So there's a researcher called Karen Noor-Satina who writes about you need to be engrossed and excited by what you're doing. And so laboratory scientists have this sort of a starting point of being engrossed and excited in exploring whatever they're exploring as a laboratory scientist, a bench scientist. So there's a whole spread of these meanings, and we've picked up some of them here. I mean, top right, that sense of appearance, behavior, and so on. And professional standards from one perspective have been used to control people. Teacher education's been used to control people, and people have controlled teacher educators in the guise of professionalism, particularly women. So as teachers, you know, you can be a teacher but you can't be married is in the history of many countries. You can be a teacher educator but you can't be married. Meg Maguire did a fantastic PhD years and years ago about teacher educators in London, women who had to live above the shop, peeling the potatoes and making the food for their student teachers downstairs, and if they married, they were out. So profession and professional standards have been used to control. There's also a sense of people being morally sound, respectful of hierarchies. I mean, one of the things that I noticed when I was towards the end of my school teaching career was how unacceptable it was then, maybe it still is now, for someone to be showing a bit of tattoo poking out of a sleeve or coming up above your shirt. So that policing of the appearance. On the other side, there are what some people call classical conceptions of profession. So that comes from Eric Hoyle and Peter John, you know, which very often come around a specialist body of knowledge. You've got expertise. That makes you a professional. Specialized knowledge, you're highly qualified. But without the next kind of set there, that's sort of a technician in a way, because then you have people who are public-facing. So your pharmacist, your doctor, your lawyer, your accountant, your teacher educator. And very importantly, there's a sense of trust. Are you still a profession if you lose trust, if you lose public trust? Independent? I mean, that was the old sense. If you were an expert for hire, you know, pre-1948 in the UK, you would have to find pennies and shillings to pay your doctor. If you couldn't do that, then you didn't get treatment. sociologists have become fascinated, have for 50, 60 years in professions. So some of those terms in the middle, like state-mediated, I think is really a useful term. Teachers are a state-mediated profession. And that was from Johnson, a researcher called Johnson in 1972. And what Johnson meant was, if you're a teacher, you don't decide who your clients are. If you're an architect, you do. You have a choice. There's an exchange relationship. And your clients don't have a choice about whether they come to you. You know, the state tells them you're going. So there's a state interest in teaching as a profession, and there's certainly a state interest in teacher education as an occupational group as well. The other one that just above that, not organized by the logic or the market or the organization, that's another sociologist called Friedson. And that was the kind of third view of professionalism, that, you know, you're not part of an organization and you're not driven by the market. That's probably changed too. So since that kind of written, you would say that certainly teaching has been influenced by markets, marketization, new public management, and so on. Identity. So I'm not going to make you do that, because we would be here until 3 o'clock if we did that. This is obviously huge, and I've been very selective here. But there's something about identity that is about sameness at the same time as it's about difference. About things that we have in common, and things that are personal, and things that are professional, that's dynamic and not fixed. So from one perspective, that kind of multiplicity of identities that someone has is a bit of an interesting challenge to the notion of a single fixed professional identity for the teacher, which is enforced by professional standards, for example. It might depend on the type of school you're teaching at, or the sector of schools that you're teaching in. There's a very strong, and this is related to the comment that a colleague made when I asked about profession, an affective dimension to it. It matters. So who you are, your identity or identities, matters to you. If your identity comes under threat, you feel it. And you respond to it in different ways, and that's something I will come back to later. And then the other kind of interesting part of this identity keyword from the perspective of teacher education, I think, is how important it is in learning. So, you know, we've known from people like Dorothy Holland, Jean Lave, Etienne Wenger, and so on, James Paul Gee, and the notion of, you know, learning how to play computer games. Being a gamer, being a computer gamer, or being a teacher is about becoming an identity. It's a kind of cultural figure. It's a cultural figure, very significant one in our culture, the teacher. It comes with it all kinds of associations, all kinds of cultural resources, and it's an important part of our motivation to become a teacher. If we don't like the identity, if we don't feel effectively drawn to being a teacher or a teacher educator, then it's quite hard to do. I'm not to say you can't do it, like being a merchant banker. You might not like what you have to do as a merchant banker, but you like other aspects of it, like the money. But the importance of identity in learning is increasingly being recognized. And I think that makes it really important for teaching and teacher education. Agency. So I think with agency, there is a lurking ghost of a word behind that. And the lurking ghost of the word, I think, is autonomy. It's a different word. It's used in different contexts. It has the kind of different vectors in terms of how it can be understood. But I think in all of these kinds of ways of understanding agency, autonomy is there to some extent. So agency, depending on how you define it, how your understanding of its use in context, it does involve a sense of freedom. It does involve a sense of having your potential realized, or being able to act and think independently, but increasingly, again, from a more kind of social, psychological, anthropological position, within constraints. There's no, in the context of a society, absolute autonomy. It's relative, and certainly for professional groups that serve the public, clients, patients, students, there are reasonable constraints on what we can do. There's reasonable constraints on our agency. So in other words, the identity of a teacher, the identity of a teacher educator, is a way of mediating our capacity to act in the world. If we assume that, and then we assume the kind of standards and expectations that come with being part of a profession, then we have to allow our agency to be mediated through that particular identity. So why are these, I think, keywords in teacher education? I really do think that they are, and they have been in the history of teacher education and in the history of research in teacher education. You know, these have occupied a lot of people's time as researchers and as teacher educators. Well, I think they really do capture some of the dynamics of the field. Just in terms of profession, what that means for us or for teachers, when we think, for example, of a history in which teachers were children apprenticed to a teacher, who then go through a form of day training, higher education. They don't have to be a graduate, then they have to be a graduate, then they have to have a master's degree, and so on and so forth. There are things there about our field and the way that it has evolved that I think are absolutely critical, and they're represented in these key words. But perhaps I think words like profession and professionalism and professionalization, identity and agency capture this sense of our response to change. You know, when things are changing, when there's a crisis, which I'm going to allude to later in terms of England, a threat, artificial intelligence is one thing, but I'm old enough to remember something called integrated learning systems, where you're supposed to sit the child next to the BBC master computer bee, and they would spend their day being told what to do with a cursor or a key. So there's a sense to which we tend to invoke the words, and these keywords become important when there's profound change underway. And I think they're keywords in a professionalizing project for teachers and for teacher educators. So the professionalizing project, I would say, is about making a professional claim on the basis of occupational status. And that historically for teachers and teacher educators has been on the basis of knowledge. There's a body of expert knowledge. You need to know these things. And that is still true. If you look at the debates around the kind of knowledge that people need to be a teacher, it's usually driven by efficiency. It's usually driven by kind of OECD type measures. So it might be expressed in the language of core practices or routines or highly effective practices, whatever the language is. You need to know those. You need to know cognitive load theory, whatever it is. Otherwise, you don't have the professional knowledge. It's also part of the collective claim, as we were saying earlier. You are part of something that's beyond you and based on shared cultural resources in context. And also agency signals that sense of autonomy, which is a relative autonomy to act within the body of knowledge or practices and that identity. And particularly in contexts of reform, if you go through profound reform in teacher education, then you feel these words and the changing meanings and the implicit threat that comes with the change very, very, very keenly. And it's not just at the level of an abstract policy analysis or a pragmatic response to being told what to do. It matters. You really, really do feel it. So about 15 years ago, I started, when I was, Pamela was saying, working in Oxford in the Centre for Sociocultural Activity Theory Research, developing a concept called professional creativity, which in some ways I intended to reframe this professionalizing project. And in doing so, over the years, I've increasingly had policymakers in mind as I've developed it, because increasingly, as the years have gone on, I've worked more with them, whether that's in England or Norway or Australia or China or wherever. My way of interpreting and developing this idea has been influenced by the need to explain it and why it's important and useful to a policymaker as well as to our colleagues, teacher educators and teachers. So I took the concept of profession, the kind of theories of profession and professionalism from a sociologist called Adler, Paul Adler at USC. And this is a kind of paraphrased definition from Paul Adler's work. It's a type of collaborative community, but it must manage at least two directions of activity simultaneously. The word activities there is important, not in a theoretical sense, activity theory, but in terms of, it's what you do that we're interested in here. One that encourages disputation and deliberation amongst the particular community. So, over the next day and a half, you should be having lots of deliberation and disputation within this community, professional community. A sharing, a very open and sharing and a transformation of intellectual heritage, learning. At the same time, the other direction, outward. So open to peers in other communities, so teacher educators, open to the teaching profession, teacher community, to teacher unions, to policymakers and so on, and also the wider publics, and accountable to them, kind of an expanded collectivity. Some of the most interesting examples that Adler comes up with, it's from medicine. And medicine is quite a good example of the influence of Dr. Google. How many people here in the room, I know I was when I lived in Australia, standard response from a GP when you hit 60, statin, half an aspirin. No, thank you. Why? Because you look at what the research says and you make, as a patient, a balanced judgment about risk. If I take this drug, it might do this. Type 2 diabetes is associated with the use of statins, for example. So that's normal now. Years ago, I could imagine being thrown out of a GP surgery for doing that, in the same way that a parent coming to a school asking why you've made that comment on a child's book is normal. So that's a really important, the two directions, that sense of continuously deliberating and disputing what we know and who we are and what our values are, at the same time as kind of outward engagement. And professional creativity seems to be a way, for me anyway, of kind of reconciling those tensions. So a profession, teaching, teacher education, should at its heart have this sense of professional creativity. Knowledge creating, relational and values-based responsibilities, based on a future-oriented, that's really important, future orientation to our work, rather than looking at the past, all our work going into keeping it the way it always was. Intellectual interdependence, being open to each other's ideas, but also being open to ideas from other fields. That's publicly available and accountable to societies. Now, that's something that we and other professions have had to do because societies have changed, expectations have changed, but it's something that I think very often does get lost in our own work, in our own capabilities, because of the pressure that we sometimes feel to comply with reform. It gets squeezed. Our work goes into compliance. It doesn't go into the kind of more expansive notion of trying to understand where we're going in the future, where our work is going, what kind of knowledge that we need, what kind of values we need, and so on. I think it's got very big implications for teachers, teacher educators, and policymakers, and how you can then develop a professional set of professional communities, I think, is the challenge. I think one of the big implications for teachers, as in school teachers, classroom teachers in schools and school leaders, how do you own and develop the claims for professional status? As a teacher or as a principal, how do you have a stake? How do you lead? How do you co-develop knowledge? How do you have an influence in the set of kind of values, ethical principles, and so on that underpin the kind of standards? And there needs to be some sort of infrastructure for that. It's almost impossible to expect schools to invent something, but bodies, or a body that somehow brings the profession together in a way that, for example, that doctors do, or that architects do, or that scientists do, a kind of an overarching professional body that may have a stake in standards that the state decides, but are kind of curators of professional knowledge and people who create the kind of sense of ethical obligations and so on. For teacher educators, I think it means understanding also, and sometimes this can be a challenge, we're not teachers. You know, teachers decide the professional knowledge base, set of values. It's the teacher. They're the people. We might have been teachers. I was a teacher, but I'm now a teacher educator. I have been a teacher educator. So I think our responsibility is to co-develop with teachers, but also very, very importantly, to stimulate and to re-energize this professional creativity that can be basically sapped, you know, it can be lost through the day-to-day busyness of a classroom, through the way that sometimes leadership operates, through the way that reform acts and so on. So I think we have a very important role in that, both in terms of people starting out on a career as a teacher and also in their ongoing lifelong development as a teacher. And I think there are profound implications for policymakers. How can you make policy as a teacher, as an education policymaker, that enable teachers and teacher educators to take responsibility for professional creativity within that broad political values-based framework and set of expectations for societies, perfectly legitimate that policymakers and politicians have that, democratically elected people have broad, strong views, aims, aspirations for education in society. But how can you give responsibility and hold teachers and teacher educators to account within that framework, not to micromanage, not to continually decide what has to be done. And in some countries, and I think England is a really good example, which I'm going to come on to, you know, they say these days if a homework isn't marked in an English school, the Secretary of State's got to make a comment about it. You know, same as if an operation doesn't go well in a hospital, the politician's got to make a comment about it. That's bad for politicians and policymakers. That eats their time because they're constantly having to respond to micro-level things. So it is a brave policymaker, brave politician that says we're investing all this money in the school system or the teacher education system or the universities. You've got PhDs, you've got loads of grants, you've won prizes, you're working with these fantastic teachers, do something. It does happen. So I was involved in reform in Norway, as Pamela said, from 2016 to 2020. The directions of the reform at the invitation of the Norwegian government were determined by teachers and teacher educators, large multi-stakeholder conferences like this. They came up with a set of ideas. They then worked on that with government, and my role with Marilyn Cochrane-Smith, Karen Hammernes, Auli Toom from Helsinki was to help them. We weren't inspectors, we were an international group of people who just went around. I always ended up in the north, where it was coldest. But that was our job, was to help people develop policies that their representatives had come up with. So it is possible. And the arguments that I make to policymakers, and I've made it successfully in some of the Gulf states, who are really ramping up their education systems because they're running out of oil and they need to change the way that their schools are preparing citizens for their new types of societies, is if you're going to invest lots and lots of money, which they have in your school system and in your university system, fund it generously and expect a great deal from the people. Don't spend all your money producing folders or websites that tell people what to do in a micro level. They've been really well educated, really well prepared to teach, really well prepared to be researchers and so on. Exploit that and make that a kind of expectation. To the counter-example. So if you really want an example of a place where it all went horribly wrong, it's England. This book came out in 2023 as an ebook. And that's a QR code, and if you get the QR code, you can download a free copy. And it's an edited book, and in fact there are some Irish colleagues in the book giving a sense of how what went on in England relates to what's happened in Ireland. There's some Australian colleagues doing a similar thing. What the book is, it's not a highly theoretical book. It basically says this is what happened in England with teacher education between 2019 and 2022, which just so happens to coincide with Boris Johnson's tenure as Premier. And it was really bad. So to give you, it's not to say that it was new. You know, teacher educators have always been under the thumb in England, as elsewhere. But they were basically given something called a core content framework. They were told what to teach. They then had to show even their PowerPoint slides to entirely untrained civil servants. Sorry, they were trained, but they were trained by the EEF, not by the universities or the teacher educators. They had to have those approved. If they weren't approved, then they didn't get accredited, and some people then pulled out of teacher education or they lost their accreditation. It was a total and utter disaster. And one of the main purposes of doing the book was actually just to tell the rest of the world, don't do this. And as I say, you can get a better sense of the context in your own time, but I have to say it was bad. That led us, Ian Cushing and I, to do a research project called The Affective Dimensions of Teacher Education Reforms. This was funded by the British Academy Leverhulme Trust, one of those nice small grants, which are easy to administer and you can do a lot with. And what we did is we got 42 teacher educators from universities in England for day-long workshops, focus groups, across England during 2023 and 24. So when I came back from Australia, Ian and I organised these different parts of England. Remember, we're not talking about Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. England's very, very specific within the UK. And then in November 24, we did something called a reimagining workshop, which I'll come on to talk about in a moment. But that was the outline of the project. So it was quite small, but without those length of focus groups and with the imagining workshop, huge amounts of data and huge amounts of artifacts from the workshop as well. So I have no idea what that was. Maybe it was Boris Johnson. So the regional focus groups, the very strong response was affective, right? So it wasn't a kind of a sense of an argument about whether they were good or bad reforms. There was a huge sense of fear. And that was quite difficult because it obviously led people to relive parts of their experience. So we had to have very sort of strong kind of ethical guidelines for our project. And there's a very good book by an IOE long retired researcher called Alex Moore called The Affected Teacher. And Alex Moore distinguishes between two different types of fear. Very interesting distinction. There's material fear, where you think, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose my job. How will I pay my mortgage? And then there's psychic fear. And psychic fear is in some ways more insidious, because it means you can't be or do what you wanted to do in the beginning. You came in to be a teacher, you came in to be a teacher educator, but you're afraid if you do what you've always done and what you want to believe is right, you've just lost your sense of identity. You've lost who you are. So those were the predominant types of fear, and fear was the predominant kind of emotion leading to the response. There was some anger, but anger was fairly minimal. Now, that did surprise us, but actually the literature on anger in terms of affect and reform suggests that unless you've got individual named people to blame, you don't tend to be angry. You've got to have a target for your anger. You know, Viv Ellis, I'm really angry at him because he did this. But if it's just a bureaucracy, it's more likely that you'll be fearful and anxious. the thing that became clear was that, and this is Frank Coffield's work from a long time ago, fear has been used consistently as a tool of reform in England. And we felt that this really had very strong structural implications for teacher-educator capacity and capability. The thing we did, I mean, the paper that emerged from those focus groups with these incredible stories, which were analysed using different iterations of affect theory and policy enactment theory, will come out later this year in the British Educational Research Journal. It's not out yet. We've got minor revisions to do, which I've got to do by November the 5th. So if you want to see the kind of the devastation at a personal level of what happened to people who felt their profession, their identity, their agency was under attack, you can read the article. This part of it was intended to be more optimistic, more forward-looking. This was the re-energizing professional creativity that I talked about. So what we did was we managed to get only 12 of these teacher educators before, and the reason for only getting 12 was they couldn't be released from their universities. We found it incredibly difficult, even with travelling expenses and even with cover for substitutes available. People, heads of department, were reluctant to release people, which in itself is an interesting factor, I think. We spent the day basically freeing their kind of imagination and agency and so on. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I was an English teacher. I don't know whether any of you who are English teachers ever taught what was essentially a simulation called School Under Siege. Did you read it? School Under Siege was developed, I think, in the 80s or the 90s, came out of English teachers in London. The teacher wore a white coat, came into the classroom and said, an infectious disease has just taken over a school, and none of you can go home. And the response from younger children was very often to burst into tears. So you can tell why that isn't done these days, because it was found somewhat traumatic. But the idea was you built an imaginative context. You can't go home. There is a disease out there. You have to stay here. And it was used essentially as an imaginative context for writing. So what we did was we created an imaginary context using artificial intelligence. And we did a deep fake version of Bridget Phillipson. That's Bridget Phillipson, who is the Secretary of State for Education in England. As I said, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, different in England. And I can't show it to you because it's very strictly controlled by the ethics that we got for the project. We could only show it in the context of the research setting. And it was pretty good. And Bridget says, welcome. I just want you to know you've been undervalued over the years. You're the experts. You know what you're doing. And I'd like to invite you each to do a draft for the first part of a white paper which will herald a new age of teaching and teacher education. And we got one little edit blip in it, which was about a minute and a half in, when some people realized it was a fake. But until the edit blip, people were just aghast. But that had come after a morning of basically setting things up. So, good morning, everyone. Oh, you've got it. Sorry, I move on. I only sent the PowerPoint. I don't know how that ended up on that. The question was, what do you want? Okay, we've done this research with you and you've told us how devastated you are. You've told us how bad the reforms are. What do you want? How can it be different? And we had to go through things like this. Don't take anything for granted. Selection, recruitment, retention. In England, as in a small number of other countries, I'm not sure about Ireland actually, every student teacher is interviewed. Every single one, and probably hundreds more that don't get a place, are interviewed. Makes no difference. Countries without interviews have about the same attrition rates from teacher education programs. Length of field experience, practicum placements, and the degree of integration. Just because you're used to having 6 weeks, 10 weeks, forget it. What do you want? When do they actually qualify? So we've done this in the morning with them. Do they qualify at the end of the course? Or is that like their license to get into the school and then they qualify officially in a year or two's time? What about the teaching workforce itself? Do we need to change the teaching workforce, create more opportunities for career progression that don't go up towards leadership and principals? Teacher mobility. We will prepare teachers, 20% of them will move to the UAE to save money for a mortgage. How do you factor that in to your workforce planning and to how you teach them? Because it's a fact, it's not unique to any one country. You know, I was in Australia watching London head teachers come to Melbourne to recruit Australian students to go to London schools. And I was then hearing about Australian principals going to London to recruit British teachers to go to Australian schools. Apparently here there was an article in an Irish newspaper that said, where have all our teachers gone? And a principal of a school in Sydney said, they're here. He said, I can't pronounce any of their names. But if they weren't here, we wouldn't have a staff. Now that's a reality. And that notion of an Australian travelling the world, you know, New Zealanders travelling the world, the OE, the overseas, it's been a thing for decades. But now, yeah, if you qualify, you don't just choose if you're British between private sector and state. You choose Australia, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, private school in Thailand. It is a globally, so we factored all of these things in, and we also came back to this nugget at the end. Who are we? What is our expertise? Do we all need the same expertise? Do we all need to be brilliant practitioners, brilliant researchers, and so on? And that notion of the clinical staff that kind of bedeviled lots of debates about teacher education over the years. So what we did, we set it up. We got our artificially intelligent Bridget Phillipson, who gave this invitation, use of generative AI to really create a very powerful imaginative context. There was a degree of belief in the context. And they wrote, and then we published this pamphlet. So if you want to read it, again, the QR code there will take you straight to this little booklet. And I've got some copies here, hard copies if you'd like some. And we were amazed. Because if you'd spent, you know, best part of a year at 4 groups, doing these focus groups and then analysing the data and hearing about the terrors, the night sweats, the anxiety, the fear about paying the mortgage, the loss of sense of who you are because you can't do what you came into the profession as a teacher to start with. If you heard all of that, I have to say, Ian and I had really serious worries about, would they be able to open up? Would they be able to exercise their imagination? Would they be able to think in a very kind of expansive way? And the answer was, my goodness, yes, they were. They really were. So these are essentially the key themes. If you're interested in the detail and how they wrote it, you can read in that little pamphlet. Right at the top, and I can tell you, I nearly burst into tears when this came through in the data. So important. Remember, this is in a policy document that these teacher educators are imagining they've got to write. A view of the teacher as someone involved in an ongoing discussion about the purposes of education and a good society. The importance of engaging teachers' intellects, imagination, and empathy. Recognition of the child as more than a brain behind a desk, and the relationships going beyond the child to their families, communities, cultures, and society as a whole. Phased models of initial qualification, with a final qualification awarded at the end of the early career period, effectively provisional registration to go and teach. The reality of social justice, so not pandering to this notion of wokeism, but recognizing there have been inequalities, structural, there's been oppression, there's been all kinds of things that have led to the situations that we see now in relation to people from different cultures and race, social classes, genders, and so on. So ITE's been part of that. You know, I had a mentor as an early career teacher educator called Dr. Carol Fox, who wrote a wonderful book about storytelling. And Carol was taught that black children in London were educationally subnormal. That was the fact within the teacher education programme. And finally, depoliticised accountability mechanisms. How can you rise up above the political imperative to have a longer-term view? And the longer-term view is something that Finland has done very effectively. People talk a lot about Finland, but basically Finland planned its society, planned its education system, sort of immediately post-war, but then especially from the 1960s. I met what you call a permanent secretary or a secretary within the Finnish Ministry of Education, and I asked, how come you've managed to keep your education policy so stable for so long? And her answer, she would probably have been sacked if she'd said this in England, but she said, well, we keep it away from the politicians. We make sure that we protect what we know is good and that works. So the job there is for the politicians to argue with the civil servants. This response from the teacher educators in the workshop that you can read about in there absolutely, completely blew us away. It was very clear to us then that this was a moment for the English teacher educators. It could be for English teacher educators a new era. It could be. So they recognised they were heavily involved in state work. Their work was state mediated. They knew that they'd been constrained and regulated just as the same way they enact that on their own students through standards and so on. They know that their gaze was very often local jurisdiction focus, responsive, very often framed by an audit culture and performance expectations are already predetermined. But the sense of like accelerating crises, whatever the cause of the crisis is, creates opportunities. So the sense of perhaps it was a moment for them. We wrote to Bridget Phillipson after the research was finished. She didn't meet us, but she gave us a meeting with a senior civil servant who read this and who read the report. And it was a very interesting meeting in which clearly someone who's been in post for a long time and had to manage policy under Boris Johnson, she was there then, and she's there now under a Labour government, was trying to basically how you work to turn around an oil tanker with no money. Very difficult job. But the sense that we got, the question was, you know, from our perspective to the policymaker, basically you've beaten up teacher educators in England over a long period of time, but especially then. This is how they feel, this is what's happened. Does it matter? That was our question, the first question. And I was fully expecting the answer, no. Because I've heard that answer before, and it's usually justified by the sentence, the need for change is so urgent that rapid intervention is necessary. And she said, no, absolutely. So it's one of those things that you don't have to wait for now how politics unravels, what else is going on, what else is going on in the economy and in government to see how much change will be possible in England. So, SCoTENS then, what do you want? Over your conference, where your committee has written your blurb highlighting the fact you're going into a new era, and there are some key words there, what are the dynamics underlying these key words for you here in Ireland? What's the range of meanings? And what, if any, are the reasonable constraints on those meanings in the broader social, societal, and political contexts? So at that point, I'm going to stop and have a little bit of time for questions or discussion. So you can make a point, you don't have to ask a question. So who will start us? We have a roving microphone as well. So I'm going to call on the SCoTENS committee. Who would like to make a comment or ask a question? Come on, SCoTENS committee. You wrote it. Great. Thank you, Maria.
Thanks so much. Viv, Viv, thanks very much for that. Maria Campbell, ATU St Angela's. From what you've seen from, say, your experiences of being an extern both in Queen's and in St Angela's, so you've had an experience of North and South, does anything stand out for you in particular in relation to similarities or differences between the English context, between, say, that period you spoke of, and what you have seen, you experienced in both jurisdictions?
Yeah. So my Queen's we're trying to work out when my Queen's experience was, but it was quite a long time ago. So it's not easy to make an easy comparison. And my St Angela's experience was more recent. And I was doing it in the context, the externing, of the Pasi Salberg being driven around Ireland thing. So it was a very different, it was in flux then, and the whole notion of the professional masters and so on. That direction, the professional masters, for example, is the way that Norway went. And that's what the teacher educators wanted there. I'm not sure how much the teachers wanted it. And the thing that created for Norway, sorry, and I don't know, haven't caught up recently with how this has worked in Ireland, they had no entry routes into the professional masters in Norway. You had to start at year 1 and end at year 5. So in other words, you couldn't do a degree in maths and then do a professional masters. So that was a problem for them because they've got a teacher shortage like many other countries. But the thing that was most noticeable, even to the level there were cartoons in national newspapers, was how different the teachers were coming out of the professional masters. So there was one cartoon in a Norwegian newspaper of a staff room in a school and some kind of fairly hacked off teachers in there drinking tea. And the new teacher bursts through the door with a microscope and a cello and tennis racket and everything else. This is a national daily newspaper, you know, all singing, all dancing, research skills and so on. And like, it didn't, what they were teaching and the kind of capabilities they were developing in the new teacher was a very different thing to what was already in school. Now, in Norway, that had support from the teacher unions. That made that easier to implement. It had the support from the student teacher unions too. I'm not sure to what extent that happened in Ireland, and as I said, it was a while ago since I kind of left. Just anecdotally, my strongest memory of Queen's, other than great colleagues who are sadly passed, was one lesson, this is the context is all, in the middle of Belfast on temptation, which involved the student teacher putting a Quality Street chocolate on everybody's desk and seeing how long it stood there before she developed this absolutely wonderful lesson about temptation. My sense at the time was, and this is a long time ago, early 2000s, late 2000s, Northern Ireland teacher education was more like England. So I don't know whether things have changed a great deal since then. Yeah. Anything else? I know you're waiting for your scones, which are coming up shortly, but I think I recognize Noel from around that time. Yeah.
Yes, Noel Purdy, Stranmillis University College. Welcome back, Viv, to SCoTENS. You talked on the way through there about the English experience of developing the core content framework for initial teacher education. In Northern Ireland, we're just about to go down that same route. Are there any lessons you think we can learn from the English example?
I'll go back a few slides, shall I? Look, it's interesting. What I would say is the clue is the broader political context I gave you. It happened during Boris Johnson's government. It was chaotic. It was vicious. It was nasty. It sort of picked people off. It made the person of the teacher educator a target. That was what distinguished that particular period. And so what they did at the same time as saying, we're going to have this framework and you're going to do it, was do things that people like Michael Gove had been saying during the Brexit referendum, is don't listen to experts. So there was this undermining of things. They then had to go out and find people who weren't experts to write the core content framework. That's my reading of it. It's also the reading of many people in the book. I think there is a way of doing, and this is something that we worked on in the UAE for the UAE government when I was at Monash, of developing an initial and early career framework that has certain entitlements as well as expectations. And the thing that we did in the UAE with their government, which the English government didn't do with that core content framework, I don't know about Northern Ireland now, was that it engaged with schools as they really are. It didn't say that we have to pretend that this little activity is school-like, you know, a bad simulation, a bad kind of piece of deliberate practice. We have to put something in there about what should a student teacher or an early career teacher expect from a school in terms of support and professional development. So I think it's possible to do, and we were in the position of doing that in the UAE because English ministers are very good going around the world going, look what we're doing, and we've got this thing, and isn't it marvelous? And, you know, I've spent 5 years going, no, it isn't, to anyone who will listen. But that is not to say that a coordinated framework for teacher development is a bad thing. And in fact, when I've spoken to civil servants, when that book came out, by the way, which was towards the end of the life of that government under Rishi Sunak, how he knew this is beyond me. Someone in the Prime Minister's office emailed me and said, congratulations on the book. And that led to the first conversation that I'd had with someone in real power in English education since New Labour left office in 1999-2000. So, and the point is always that, you know, the point is, as a government, we want to set a framework. We want to have expectations for what universities will do, what schools will do to ensure that our new teachers can thrive and they can stay in the job. I think you can do that. I just think the way that that was done had another kind of intent, and it was done in a very Boris Johnson kind of way. So, you know, that's the point that I was making there. I'd be very interested at another point, not right now, to hear about your framework. I better come to the end because I think we're waiting for refreshments and things. Yeah?
Hopefully a video.
And a video, okay. Here's the invitation. If you've got an idea for a book, let me know. If you go to that URL, you can see the proposal guidance. You can look at some of the other books. We want to get to 25 books in the series in the next 2 years. They're peer-reviewed, so that does slow it down, because the proposal's peer-reviewed and then the manuscript's peer-reviewed. They're short. That's how thick they are. They're not big, 20 to 25,000 words, punchy, and there are examples that you can read. So it would be lovely to have that connection with SCoTENS, given that this is actually where the idea started. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today in the beautiful surroundings of Lough, but I am pleased to share a message of support as SCoTENS continues to be a powerful force for educational excellence, and I value the work you do. Through our Transform Ed strategy, we have set out a bold and ambitious vision for educational reform in Northern Ireland. We have a renewed focus on the core areas of curriculum, assessment, qualifications, tackling educational disadvantage and school improvement, all underpinned by a relentless focus on supporting effective teaching through significant investment in professional learning. We're investing in teachers at every stage of their career, from initial education to continuous professional learning and leadership. Your role as teachers and educators is central to this vision, I hope today's conference inspires new ideas, deepens connections and reaffirms our shared commitment to empowering educators and improving outcomes for every child. Thank you, and I wish you a productive and inspiring conference.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I want to say a huge thank you to Pamela Cowan and to Julie Ukustelva for the kind invitation. I really regret not being with you in person, but I'm delighted to contribute to this important conversation. Education and teaching, especially North-South cooperation, are vital to building trust and partnerships across our island. SCoTENS plays a unique role in fostering high-quality research and collaboration among colleges of education. And this year's theme, Teacher Identity, Authenticity and Agency, really is timely. We're living through a period of such transformation, and so I've launched a national convention on education to reflect on the future of teaching and learning. Digital tools, when we use them purposely, can transform our learning. And so our strategies, such as the literacy, numeracy and digital literacy strategy and the digital strategies for schools, support this alongside IDGE's professional learning programmes. AI is reshaping education. My department will soon publish guidance on AI in schools to help educators use it safely and ethically. And so I welcome the joint North-South initiative on digital citizenship, especially in combating misinformation. Curriculum shapes teacher professionalism. Recent reforms reflect our commitment to inclusive, future-focused education. The redeveloped primary school curriculum, it values teacher expertise and supports all learners. At senior cycle, new subjects like climate action and drama reflect the evolving student needs. The junior cycle framework, it balances subject knowledge with skills development and encourages teacher collaboration. Global citizenship, inclusion and well-being are now central to teacher education. And so initiatives like the Peace Plus, shared learning and youth mental health programmes promote resilience, peace and cross-border cooperation. Two increasingly important aspects of teacher professionalism are global citizenship education and inclusive education, as well as the well-being of teachers and students alike. These key aspects of education have become a core element of teacher education. It is a great achievement that the official launches of the approved Peace Plus shared learning projects, Peace Youth Programme projects and the Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing Programme projects have been held. These projects will make a real difference to support our children, our young people, educators and youth settings, in addition to building engagement, resilience and promoting peace, inclusion and respect, while also bringing our cross-border communities closer together. In terms of research, this empowers teachers as reflective practitioners. The T-REX project is a major innovation, enabling educators across the island to share insights and to collaborate. Congratulations to Dr. Karen Orr on her appointment as North-South Director of T-REX. Our national convention will include voices from across education, students, parents, teachers and learners, and I hope to incorporate Northern Ireland perspectives. The upcoming conversation will guide future reforms and ensure that our system meets the needs of all our learners. Over 150 SCoTENS funded projects have advanced teacher education and cross-border collaboration. And so I'm pleased to have secured €19 million in the recent budget to support curriculum development and ongoing teacher professional learning. Our teachers are central to our shared goals for education. I look forward to continued cooperation across the island to tackle disadvantage and to promote excellence and inclusion. Let's keep children, let's keep young people at the very heart of everything that we do. Thank you very much again, and I wish you a productive and inspiring conference.
So if we could just extend our thanks to Professor Ellis, and he will be available over the next 2 days to answer the questions today and tomorrow, and to answer any questions that may come up at coffee time or over the meal. And thank you as well to our two Ministers of Education for their video. Unfortunately, their schedules didn't allow them to be with us today, but I think it's great that they took the time out just to produce those videos for us, and we'll share them on the website too. So the next step refreshments, and then on to our presentations in the parallel sessions. So please enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and I'll see you all at the drinks reception this evening and the meal. Thank you.